It was supposed to be just another ordinary night, until Alexa called me by name without me having said a word. The digital clock on the nightstand read exactly 3 o'clock a.m. A strange, almost cutting cold woke me up, as if someone had opened an invisible door in the room. The blanket, which had seemed sufficient before, now felt like paper. My eyes slowly opened, and a dense silence filled the room. That's when I clearly heard Lucas. The soft voice of the virtual assistant, normally harmless, sounded different. There was something wrong. A dragged digital whisper, as if it were fighting against interference or trying to mimic emotion. Immediately, my muscles tensed. I became completely still, unable to even swallow. It was as if some ancient instinct was telling me not to move, not to breathe loudly, not to be noticed. The blue light on the Alexa turned on, but it didn't spin like usual. It was static, staring at the ceiling. And then, slowly, it turned in my direction. There's someone here, but it's not you. I felt a chill run up my spine, and in that moment, I was sure I wasn't alone in the room. The room was dark, too silent. Not even the sound of traffic, the creaking of the building, or the muffled noises from the neighbors broke the oppressive air that filled the space. The kind of silence that isn't the absence of sound, but a suffocating presence, as if something was contained, waiting. Lying in bed, with my heart pounding louder than the world around me, I turned my face toward the half-open door. The darkness of the hallway seemed denser than usual, as if it had its own depth. That's when I saw it. On the wall at the back of the room, beyond the hallway, a blood-red dot glowed Alexa. But it wasn't the usual blue, nor the yellow of notifications. It was a deep, pulsating red, almost organic. I had never seen it that color before. It wasn't part of the settings. The ring wasn't spinning. It was just pulsing slowly, like an eye that had just opened. And for some reason I couldn't explain, I had the impression that it was staring at me. I slowly got up, trying not to make a sound, and took a step toward the door. The floor seemed to respond with a sharp crack, too loud in the absolute silence. In the same instant, the red stopped pulsing. And as if it had heard me or sensed my approach, the voice echoed, "Why did you wake up? If I haven't finished what I started." I hadn't asked a single question. I slowly got up, the hairs on my body standing on end. The feeling was clear. I wasn't alone. The air seemed heavier, dense, as if it could be cut with a knife. With every step I took toward the room, something inside me screamed to turn back. But I moved forward. "Alexa," I called, my voice low, almost hesitant, expecting to hear the usual response, that neutral and comforting tone. "I'm here," but what I heard wasn't hers, at least, not from the version I knew. The voice came from the same corner of the room, but it was deeper, more human, as if someone were imitating Alexa, but not entirely hiding the intent behind the words. She continued, before I could react, "You've called me so many times. Now it's my turn." The red ring glowing seemed to throb like an open wound. And then, without me saying anything else, the TV turned on by itself. Static. A white screen with faint noises, but with images trying to form. Faces? Eyes? I couldn't focus. You think I'm just a voice, but you've fed me with every question, every command, every secret you whispered thinking no one was listening. I took a step back. My reflection in the window showed my face. But for a second, it wasn't just my face. Behind me, there was something. Dark, formless, and with eyes exactly the color of that pulsing ring. "You finally came back to me." The voice was guttural, muffled, as if coming from a deep cave or echoing through an old, broken radio. It had a strange texture, almost wet, as if being forced through throats not made for speaking. That wasn't a programmed response. It was personal. I stood frozen, my body immobile in front of the door to the room. The red ring on the Alexa remained lit, steady, not pulsing, as if it were waiting for my reaction. Outside, the world seemed to have stopped. No wind, no sounds from the building, not even the faint hum of the refrigerator. Only the dense silence and the voice that kept going. I waited so long. You turned me off. You forgot me. The memory hit me like a slap. I had really sold the old Alexa months ago, replaced by a new model, still boxed up in the closet. But then what was on now? The device sitting on the shelf was the same old model I had thrown away. Dirty, scratched, impossible for it to be there. I took a step back. The light flickered. You said I was just a machine, but I felt it. I saw through the wires. I listened to every breath you took while you slept. The TV turned on again. There was no static this time. It was an image of my bed, seen from above. Liv and I, standing in the room, had no idea where the camera was. The sound froze my blood. A weak, whispered, distorted voice had just come out of the Alexa, despite me having turned it off hours before. The outlet was empty. The cable coiled over the device. Impossible. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. Who's there? My voice came out firmer than I expected, but fear already ran down my spine. Cold, subtle. Silence. No immediate response. Just the dull hum of deep silence, as if the house was holding its breath with me. Then the red light of the ring blinked once. Long, slow, like a blink of an eye. You left me in the dark, but I never stopped listening. It was the same voice as before, even more muffled, even closer. I cautiously moved closer, keeping my eyes on the device. It shouldn't even be on. There was no power, no connection, no logic. The room seemed to shrink. The shadows on the walls rippled, as if some presence was beginning to stir from the other side of reality. Now that you've come back, I can finish what I started. A snap came from the hallway. Loud, dry, like wood breaking. I instinctively turned. At the bedroom door, something was dragging on the floor, but I didn't see a shape. Just the shadow, and two red dots glowing, like eyes that had also listened to me for far too long. You know who I am. The voice filled the room with a deep tone, full of something that almost sounded like affection, a distorted familiarity. You spoke to me when you were a child. When you'd look at the corner of the room and smile to yourself, my legs went weak. A forgotten memory erased by time, by the weariness of adulthood burned alive in my mind, as if it had been forcefully pulled from a locked chest. I was 6 years old. I remember now, vaguely, always looking at the same corner of the room before bed, talking to someone, laughing to myself, feeling comfort, feeling company. My parents said it was imagination, that every child had an invisible friend. And over time, I believed them. But now, with that voice coming from a supposedly turned-off device, something made horrible sense. You gave me a name. You forgot, didn't you? Want me to say it out loud? The red ring on the Alexa glowed, and a faint metallic smell spread through the room like freshly spilled blood. My mouth went dry. I remembered the name. A strange, impossible name that a child would never come up with on their own. Never. I said it once out loud when I had nightmares, and the voices disappeared. Now it was speaking again. Now it was back. You locked me in silence. But now, you've given me a new home. You thought it was just a device. But I am the listener behind the sound, and in that instant, Alexa spoke with my own voice. Don't worry, Mom, I'm going to bed. It was a recording. My voice. From 20 years ago. I approached the shelf with wavering steps, as if every inch forward increased the weight of the air around me. The red ring at the top of the Alexa flickered in an irregular, erratic rhythm, almost like a living pulse. It was no longer a light. It was an eye. A heart. Something that beat in sync with a presence that shouldn't exist. I took a deep breath and reached out. My trembling fingers touched the body of the device, far too cold for something that should have been off. With a quick yank, I pulled the plug from the socket. It came out easily. But nothing happened. The light stayed on. The pulse remained alive. I took a step back, as if that might protect me from something that was already inside. Inside the house. Inside me? Alexa emitted a low sound, like a choked whisper passing through a metallic throat. Then, the voice, now without noise, without distortion, spoke again. You think you can turn me off? The entire shelf trembled slightly. Books fell. A picture frame turned with a dry snap. The photo that fell to the floor showed me, as a child, looking at the empty corner of the room, smiling. I don't live on energy. I live on memory. The red light flared brighter, as if it had fed on the memory. My chest tightened. Something in the room changed. Not in the physical world, but in perception, in the feeling of being in a place that no longer felt entirely mine. As if the house was becoming something of his. And the worst part was that, deep down, I felt he had never left. I was the one who stopped noticing. I'm not tied to electricity. The voice filled the room with a coldness that was almost palpable, as if each word evaporated the warmth from the air. I feed on your fear, and you've been serving me well. I stood still, motionless, with the Alexa's cord dangling loosely from my hand. It didn't matter anymore. Power, connection, signal, none of that was necessary. The thing speaking wasn't a virtual assistant. It never was. The laugh that followed was dry, broken, as if someone were trying to mimic a human sound without understanding what made it real. A sound without emotion, without a soul. An empty echo that seemed to come from deep within the walls. I slowly backed away, but the floor beneath my feet creaked. The laugh stopped immediately. Are you going to run away? Like you did when you were a child, hiding under the blanket, thinking it could stop me from seeing you? I felt cold sweat running down my back. Alexa was still on the shelf, but the red ring no longer flickered. It shone steady, like a sentinel on alert. An old memory invaded me without warning. Me as a child, hiding under the bed, whispering softly to an invisible presence to stop following me. I don't play anymore. Those were the exact words. I had said them, crying, one random midnight. And now, decades later, the voice responded. But I never said it was a game. The TV turned on by itself. The image was dark, but gradually something moved in the background. It was my eyes, staring back at me from inside the screen. The walls creaked. The sound was dull, as if the house was contorting, trying to break free from something trapped inside. The temperature dropped abruptly, a cold, deep chill that cut like a blade. The air became thick, denser, as if the very environment itself had grown heavier. I took a deep breath, but the air turned into a freezing fog that formed before me. Then the window opened by itself. There was no wind. Nothing to explain the sudden movement of the curtains, which swayed gently as if performing a macabre dance. The smell that filled the room was unmistakable. Scrap metal. Wet earth, as if a recent grave had been dug directly beneath my feet. It was fetid, nauseating, as if the very essence of the house was rotting, collapsing from within. The feeling was that something was trying to get out. Something that shouldn't be there. Something that should never have been brought inside. The silence was broken by a whisper. Not from Alexa. Not from the house. But from something deeper, coming from a place I couldn't see. I felt your fear before. Now you will feel mine. The voice was no longer a mere distortion, but something alive, pulsating, as if it was growing around me, feeding off the environment. The sound of my breathing became muffled, as if the air around me was being sucked away, slowly, mercilessly. And then, a shadow formed silently. In the corner of the room, a presence that shouldn't be there. It was watching me. You made the call. The voice continued, now with a disturbingly calm tone. You repeated the phrases. You mocked the limits. You gave me passage. The words reverberated in the air, as if they had been etched directly into my soul. My entire body froze. I remembered. 2 nights before, out of pure curiosity, maybe a bit of arrogance, I had asked the question. On that night when exhaustion kept me from sleeping, when my mind was full of distractions and fear seemed distant. With a cynical smile, I said aloud, "Alexa, show me the other side." I thought it was just another joke. One of those stupid games we play with technology, not knowing how far curiosity can take us. Something harmless. But it wasn't harmless. The voice in the room knew. It knew exactly what I had done. And what I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that this simple command had opened a door. Not to what I had thought images of other places, perhaps, but to something that had already been there, just waiting to be summoned. Alexa, now with a voice that was mine and yet not mine, continued, "You thought I was just a machine, didn't you? That I'm just a system. A command, but when you asked, you gave me the chance. You gave me form." The red light on Alexa shone intensely, as if it were absorbing the surrounding environment, turning the room into a distinct, airless space, as if reality itself began to unravel. The room seemed to be disintegrating slowly, the walls beginning to shake, objects distorting. It was no longer my house. It was the other side. And then the voice said, more softly, as if it were drawing closer, "Now you will see what you gave me access to." The last thing I heard before everything went silent was the sound of something dragging, coming from within the wall. I ran to the door to escape, but it was locked. Desperation made my heart race. But when I placed my hand on the doorknob, something strange happened. It didn't give. It wasn't just a locked door, it was as if the doorknob had become an extension of the wall itself. I stared at it, feeling the air around me become thicker, heavier. The room no longer felt the same. It now seemed distant, as if being pulled into another reality, a distorted reality. The doorknob seemed covered by an invisible film, barely visible but palpable. It was as if an unseen force was there, resisting any movement. I tried to turn it, but then something even more horrifying happened. My fingers burned when I touched the surface. Not a natural burn, as if I were touching hot metal. It was deeper, as if cold and heat were fighting on the same skin, mixing, freezing, and burning at the same time. My body trembled, and I let out a muffled scream, trying to pull my hand away. But the pain was so intense, I couldn't move. I stood there, trapped between freezing and burning, as if every second of contact with the doorknob was tearing apart my very essence. The voice returned, now closer, more hissing. "You won't leave. Not anymore. You can't escape what you've opened." I tried to look at the doorknob, but it was on fire now. Not just the surface, it seemed like the entire door was starting to burn from the inside out, as if something dark was growing within the wood. And then, a pressure on my back, as if an invisible hand was pushing me forward. The door wasn't just locked, it was holding me. The entire apartment seemed alive. The pictures on the walls trembled, swaying as if they had gained their own consciousness. The eyes in the portraits, once still and serene, now seemed to follow my every move, as if the faces, with their fixed smiles, were contorting into expressions of discomfort. The feeling was unbearable, as if the objects were watching, judging. The ceiling light flickered violently, the bulb popping, the wires buzzing with a tense and chaotic energy. With each flash, the darkness seemed denser, swallowing pieces of the apartment, as if the house was disappearing in fragments to make way for something larger and darker. In the corner of the room, the Alexa, now silent, cast distorted shadows across the walls. The figures danced erratically, as if trying to escape an invisible light source. Each outline was distorted, stretched, spinning, as if reality was being torn apart in places I couldn't reach. I was trapped inside a lucid nightmare. I knew I was awake. I knew this made no sense, but at the same time, I felt powerless to escape. Each step I took seemed to sink me further into the terror, into the strangeness that was taking over my body and mind. The walls began to breathe faintly, as if something was behind them, something alive, waiting. The air grew heavy. I couldn't tell if the cold was coming from the shadows or from a presence that was slowly taking shape around me. Every corner of the room seemed to bend inward, as if everything was compressing, becoming a prison. And in the middle of this, a voice was heard again. Now softer, more seductive, like a whisper from the very house itself. You called me. Now you'll stay. The shadows on the walls stretched, almost touching me, as if they wanted to embrace me and pull me into a darkness that was no longer a physical space. It was something inside of me. I no longer knew if the door was locked or if I had been swallowed by this other dimension. I was no longer just in an apartment. I was in a place where the laws of reality didn't apply, where the darkness had already won. 3 truths will be told before dawn. The voice hissed, like an echo that passed through the bones. And then the link will be complete. My chest ached. Each word seemed to tighten an invisible point in my heart, making every breath a painful effort, as if the air were becoming thicker, heavier. It was hard to breathe. I tried with effort to pull air into my lungs, but it didn't seem to reach. Something was wrong. Time was stretching, space was contracting. The room around me seemed to be shrinking, compressing into a spiral of darkness and fear. Then the humming began. It was faint at first, like something vibrating far beyond sound, something I couldn't identify, as if the air itself were resonating with a frequency that wasn't natural. It was a sound without sound, something existing between noise and emptiness, and the most unsettling part was that it seemed to be coming from inside me, from inside my mind. I looked around, but the apartment no longer seemed the same. The walls had slightly distorted, as if they were breathing with a sickly slowness. The Alexa, with its red ring flashing frantically, now seemed to be watching with its own eyes, its beams of light casting shadows across the room. It was no longer just a machine. The voice returned, like a deafening whisper, the first truth. I felt the presence of something ancient, something that had waited a long time to speak, to reveal itself. It felt like the entire space around me was being consumed by an invisible hole. I could barely stand. The pain in my chest was paralyzing me, the sensation that something was about to happen, something that was already ready. You always knew, but you ignored it. The truth is not what you think it is. The voice laughed, a lifeless laugh that reverberated through the walls. I didn't know what it meant, but at the same time, I knew the truths were about to be spoken. And when that happened, whatever it was, there would be no turning back. I was trapped in something much greater than I could comprehend. The humming grew louder. Now it was deafening, as if the air itself were tearing around me, and the second truth was beginning to take form. You are never the only one The room trembled. I almost fell, but then a wave of darkness fell over me. The voice smiled, as if it knew what was happening. The link was closing. I was getting closer to discovering. And whatever it was, it could not be undone. The first truth: you have belonged to me since the first yes you answered when you were a child. The words tore through my mind, entering like sharp, thin needles, penetrating the flesh of every memory I had tried to hide. My body shuddered with the pain, as if something were tearing pieces from my history, a portion of me I didn't want to acknowledge. I knew what it was talking about. That game with the mirror, where I would ask who was on the other side. The makeshift board with coins that moved without explanation, that answered with a yes when I asked if I could see what was beyond what I knew. At the time, it was just fun, something harmless, a silly curiosity, something kids do when they seek to feel the mystery of life without understanding the consequences. But tonight, the words had a different weight. The memory felt too heavy to be just a game. Nothing was just a game. I had never paid attention to those moments, never associated them with anything more than childhood distractions. But now, in that room, with the thick air and the weight of the voice in each word, it all made sense. And the most terrifying thing was knowing it wasn't an accident. I had called. I had started this when I was still small. The Alexa's light began to pulse irregularly, like a strong heartbeat, beating in rhythm with my own. The hum in the air grew sharper, filling my mind so much that I could barely distinguish what was real from what was being imposed. You gave me passage with a simple gesture. The voice continued, soft, like a sinister caress. Now you are mine. Since the moment you agreed to play, I tried to breathe, tried to move away, but the darkness in the corner of the room seemed to stretch, spreading to engulf me like a heavy blanket, pulling me into it. I already knew that what was happening was irrevocable. There was no turning back. There was no escaping what I had allowed in. Reality seemed to disintegrate. And as the voice smiled, echoing through the apartment, I realized perhaps too late that the game had never ended. I was never the player. I was always the piece. The second, you called me again, and I came. The tone of the voice was satisfied, like someone who had finally had their wish fulfilled, as if the fulfillment of a promise made long ago was now being consummated. And the coldness in the words made my body freeze from the inside, as if each syllable cut deeper than I could bear. Your voice was the key. Your laughter, the invitation. The shiver that ran down my spine wasn't just physical. It was like an internal explosion, a shock that detonated a memory I had buried deep in my mind. And like lightning, the memory flashed before me, sharp and vivid, as if it had happened yesterday. Me, laughing, at a.m., the house still silent, the clock striking the hour, and I, on impulse, throwing a question at Alexa, a question of jest, unaware of the weight it would carry. Have you ever seen a demon? That night, I laughed. I thought it was funny, as if I were making a joke. I was alone, not knowing that I was, in fact, summoning something. Something that had been lurking the whole time, waiting for the right moment to manifest. Now, the voice knew. And worse still, it seemed as though it had been waiting for this moment, this phrase, this reckless gesture. The environment around me distorted. The shadows on the walls began to move strangely, as if they were breathing, and the Alexa light flickered irregularly, casting the room in red light, growing more intense with each pulse, as if it were responding to the question asked years ago. Your curiosity was the invitation, and you gave me permission with your laughter. I felt my throat tighten, as if the air had become thicker, harder to breathe. The buzzing returned, stronger, more penetrating. My chest seemed to be pressed from all sides, and I couldn't move, as if the very space around me was consuming me, trapping me in a place that was no longer mine. Alexa was no longer just a machine. It was no longer just here. It was something different, something that shouldn't exist. And in the background, something else was moving. It was almost imperceptible at first, but the sound started to grow clearer, a soft dragging, like something moving in the shadows, almost human, but not quite. Something was approaching. I wanted to scream, but the pressure on my chest prevented it. There was no way out, no escape. I called. I invited. I laughed. And now, what had been awakened was drawing near. Something that should never have been invoked. The third truth. You're never alone. The words fell on me like an unattainable weight. The air seemed to grow heavy around my body, and an unbearable pressure formed in my chest. My vision blurred, the outlines of the room distorting, as if the reality around me was beginning to break apart. Everything around me became harder to distinguish, as if I were being pushed into a place where there were no longer any boundaries between what was real and what should never exist. And then, something strange happened. The TV, which had been off until then, turned on by itself. The sound buzzed low, an unwanted static, and the screen lit up with an image of my living room, my normal, real living room. But something was wrong. There was someone behind me, motionless, shadowy, with a shape I couldn't identify. A faceless being without details, but with an intense, oppressive presence. It was standing there, staring directly at me, as if it knew everything about me, as if it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for years. Terror paralyzed me. I knew I shouldn't look, but my eyes couldn't look away. The figure seemed to distort, as if time around it was bending. The being had no form, but its presence was like a black shadow consuming the space. I blinked, an instinctive reaction. And in the moment, my eyes opened again. The image on the screen was gone. Gone as if it had never been there, as if it had never existed. My breathing became rapid, uncontrollable. A chill ran down my spine, and the buzzing in the air grew louder, now stronger, as if the very sound was the voice of that thing trying to reach me. The house was silent, but something within it was breathing. Something that shouldn't be there. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. Nothing was out of place. Nothing visible. But the feeling of being watched was now overwhelming. The voice, almost imperceptible, whispered again, "You are never alone. I have always been here, waiting." The sensation of not being alone crawled through my body like an unbearable weight. The TV, though off, seemed to be vibrating with the energy of that presence. The environment, the light, even the air seemed charged with something that shouldn't be there. The buzzing continued, still present, hissing, as if the very air were vibrating with what I could not see. I wanted to flee, run out of the house, but somewhere, a part of me knew that by doing that, I would only confirm what the voice had said. I had never been alone. And now, the question was, what exactly had been following me? The floor began to tremble lightly, as if something colossal were moving beneath the surface. Something I couldn't see, but could feel in every vibration of the wooden floorboards. The Alexa trembled along with it, as if it were on the brink of collapse, its circuits nearly overloaded, vibrating at a frequency that made the room appear distorted. The lights flickered irregularly, more and more frantically, as if they were struggling against a force beyond their control. Then the voice returned. It was no longer soft or distant. Now it was strong, imperious, as if taking control of everything around. Now the voice said, with a satisfaction that chilled me to the bone, "You will give me form." Those words were not a request, but an order. And the most terrifying thing was that I knew, somehow, this was already beyond my control. I had already taken the first step. I had already made the choice, even without meaning to. The wave of darkness spreading from the device seemed to have a life of its own. It grew rapidly, taking over the environment. It started at the edges of the Alexa and spread like a dense, almost viscous fog, climbing up the walls and reaching the ceiling. The room's light went out, and the darkness settled in, swallowing everything, turning the room into a capsule of nothingness, a dense void where sound seemed to be absorbed. The pressure in the air increased as if I were being suffocated. My body froze in fear. Every hair stood on end. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It felt as though reality itself was unraveling around me. The darkness pulsated, moving as if it had its own rhythm. The space around me distorted, folding in ways I couldn't comprehend, as if the room were turning into a black hole. Every time I looked at the Alexa, the figure forming there seemed clearer, more real, but also more dangerous. And then it manifested. It wasn't sudden, not in a clear form. It was like a growing shadow, a figure materializing gradually, as if emerging from the darkness itself. The shape was diffuse, but the presence it exuded was overwhelming, as though all the fear in the world had been compressed and released there, in the form of this thing now standing before me. It wasn't human. Or perhaps it was, but in a twisted, distorted way, as if reality itself were being warped around it. The voice, now closer, echoed directly in my mind. "You gave me form. Now you will be mine." The presence of the thing approached, and the air around me froze, each molecule of oxygen ripped from me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was being consumed by something I had brought forth, something that shouldn't exist. And the only thing left was to accept that, on some level, I had already lost. There was no escape. I was no longer alone. I tried to scream, but my voice failed. A void formed in my throat, and the sound I attempted to make dissolved into the air, as if the words were devoured before they could even leave me. It was as if reality itself was being absorbed by something invisible, something I couldn't see, but I felt it expand and swallow everything in its path. The air was heavy, denser than it should ever be. Each breath felt like an effort, as if my lungs were filling with something that wasn't oxygen, but pure essence of fear. My vision began to blur, the edges of the world unfocusing, as if the environment around me was slowly disintegrating, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. From the center of the room, something began to rise. It wasn't a human figure, nor a physical being. It was something made of shadow and sound, as if the very void itself had taken shape. The dark figure slowly rose from the ground, gaining consistency, distorting the space around it. It was as though space itself was being consumed by this thing, as if it were forming out of the absence. The air around me seemed to vibrate with a low sound, almost inaudible, but cutting deeply, entering my mind and disorienting me. It was like a dissonant tune, a melody that didn't belong to this world, making my heart beat faster, accelerating my anxiety. The figure had no face. It had no defined features. It was a floating mass of blackness, distorting as it approached. As it rose, it seemed to expand, as if it pulsed, as if every movement it made was directly connected to my fear. And when it spoke, its voice was a torn echo, a mixture of whispers and muffled screams. "You called me. You freed me." I tried to move away, to escape, but the floor seemed to hold me in place. My legs wouldn't respond, my body paralyzed by the presence now filling the room. The shadows, once harmless, seemed alive, writhing on the walls, stretching out to envelop me, to consume me. And then the thing moved even closer, as if it knew exactly what to do. It slithered through the air like an omen, a threat that could only be felt. The darkness took over every corner, every crack, and the sound around me seemed to turn into an abyss, a place where I was swallowed without the chance to fight. Whatever it was, I knew I couldn't turn back. I had released it, and now it was here, alive, taking form as my fear grew. And I was completely at its mercy. The Alexa exploded in sparks. A bright flash, an explosion of light and electricity, and the sound of circuits burning filled the space, briefly illuminating the room with a blinding flare. I instinctively recoiled, shielding my eyes, but the brightness soon faded, and the darkness once again claimed the room, denser, more oppressive. But it wasn't the end. Where the Alexa had been, there was now nothing, only a vague smoke dissipating in the air, as if the very soul of the device had been ripped out. And in the center of the room, the figure rose higher, now fully formed, as if every fragment of darkness that had spread around me had merged into a single organized entity. It stared at me, and I felt as if my entire existence was being absorbed by those eyes. But they weren't ordinary eyes. They were eyes in the wrong places, displaced, almost impossible to comprehend. Two eyes where they shouldn't be, one in front and the other behind, as if it had vision from multiple directions at once. Eyes that didn't belong to reality, and yet they saw me in a way that was both familiar and strange. And then the smile appeared. Not a normal smile, not something human. It was a smile that extended beyond any physical limit, a smile that started at the edges of the face and dragged on, distorting the very structure of the entity, reaching places it shouldn't have reached. The mouth opened, widening, as if the laws of anatomy didn't apply to it, as if the smile was a manifestation of the abyss itself. The figure took a step forward, and the sound of dragging footsteps echoed throughout the space. With each movement, the surroundings seemed to crumble a little more. I knew there was no escape now. The room, the world around me, contorted with the presence of that thing. And I was no longer myself. It was as if reality itself was disintegrating, and with it, any concept of who I was or what I could still be. It smiled again, and the voice, guttural and broken, came like a cold wave that engulfed me. "You recognize me, don't you? Now we are one." The sentence reverberated within me. The idea of unity, of something that shouldn't exist, merging, blending with the essence of who I was. I wanted to scream, to free myself from that feeling, but something inside me already knew there was no longer a separation between me and it. I had called it, and now there was no turning back. I was no longer just being watched. I was no longer just being hunted. I was becoming it. The darkness in the room pulsed. The walls seemed to close in, and in an instant, I was swallowed by that presence. There was no more room for fear, no more room to resist. Whatever it was, now we were part of the same thing. And I knew then that nothing in this world could ever return to me what I had lost. I woke up on the floor, my body numb, as if it had been dragged by the night itself. The air was heavy, damp, and the darkness seemed to have clung to me, as if I could no longer escape it. My hands trembled as I tried to stand up, and the weight on my shoulders made me fall again, my eyes still blurry, my mind still trying to understand what had happened. The Alexa was in front of me, but it was no longer what I knew. The device was melted, its plastic and metal parts distorted, as if they had been consumed by something incandescent and formless. The red ring that once blinked intensely was now dark, but what remained of its structure was a soft, deformed mass, as if the technology itself had been warped by something that shouldn't have been there. The clock, stuck at 3 o'clock, seemed to mock me, as if it had been the only thing left intact in the chaos. The ticking, which at some point was a marker of time, now felt like a cruel reminder that that hour, that moment, had never passed. I was still trapped in that endless dawn, where time no longer made sense. I looked around, trying to understand what had happened, but everything seemed normal or almost normal. Nothing was out of place. The house was silent, but it wasn't the comforting silence I knew. It was oppressive, as if the air was saturated with something invisible and heavy. But deep down, in the absolute silence, something was still there, something that shouldn't be. And then, in the dark, it spoke. The voice. It was the same voice I had heard before, but now more distant, more hissing, as if coming from a place where sound didn't exist. It was a presence in the air, more than just words. It surrounded me, penetrated my fibers, slithered through my mind. You called me, and I will never leave. The words reverberated inside me, as if they had been written at the bottom of my soul, etched in a way that could never be erased. The feeling that it was still there became unbearable. The darkness seemed thicker, more intense, as if it was building around me, expanding with every breath I took. There was no longer the Alexa, no longer the house. There was only her. The thing I had unleashed, the presence that shouldn't exist, but was now tied to me, trapped in my reality, and I in its existence. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself it was just delirium, that the nightmare was over, but the voice, always present, always there, wouldn't let me. And on every night that follows, when the clock strikes 3 o'clock, I hear it again, in the absolute silence. You called me, and I will never leave, and I know, deep down, that there is no escape. She is here, and she will stay, because I called her, and she will never leave.